In the centuries preceding the 11th century, the lands comprising the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms lacked a formal or organized Jewish demographic. While commerce occurred across the North Sea, no permanent communal structures or legal frameworks existed to support a Jewish population within the British Isles during the early medieval period. The genesis of this specific community is instead located within the Duchy of Normandy, a region established along the Seine Valley in the early 10th century following the settlement of Norsemen. By the time of the Norman consolidation, northern France had developed into a sophisticated administrative landscape where the ruling dukes maintained a unique relationship with a resident Jewish minority. This population did not emerge from the indigenous Frankish peasantry, but was a result of long-distance migration from older centers in the Mediterranean and the Rhine. The capital city of Rouen served as the primary administrative and intellectual heart of this group. The legal status of these individuals was distinct from the traditional feudal pyramid that governed the lives of knights and serfs. They existed as a privileged cohort directly subordinate to the ducal authority, possessing rights of residency and transit granted by the sovereign. This arrangement allowed the dukes to bypass the rigid constraints of land-based feudalism. The economic utility of this population was defined by their mastery of financial mechanisms and international trade networks that were largely inaccessible to the contemporary Norman nobility. Because the institutional church enforced strict prohibitions against the practice of lending money for interest among the Christian laity, a commercial void existed within the developing economy. The Jewish community possessed the liquid capital and the transnational connections necessary to fill this role. They functioned as essential fiscal agents for the ducal treasury, providing the bullion and credit required for large-scale military and architectural ventures. This symbiotic relationship between the sovereign and the financiers established the foundational template for the subsequent expansion of Norman administrative power. But why did it all end with the expulsion of all Jews? And did they actually deserve it? By the middle of the 11th century, the city of Rouen emerged as the definitive administrative and cultural epicenter for the Jewish communities of northern France. Situated at the convergence of vital riverine and overland trade routes, the urban center provided the necessary stability for a highly structured communal existence. This development was characterized by the creation of sophisticated institutional precedents that would later serve as an organizational template for subsequent settlements. The residency patterns within the city were not arbitrary, but were centered on a specific district, which functioned as a jurisdictional enclave. Within this zone, the community established a multifaceted infrastructure designed to maintain religious and legal autonomy. Central to this was the Academy, an institution dedicated to the intensive study of the Babylonian Talmud, which attracted scholars from across the European continent. The intellectual output of these schools solidified the city's reputation as a legislative authority, where legal specialists interpreted complex religious mandates for a dispersed population. Beyond education, the communal administration developed rigorous protocols for managing internal taxation and charity. The leadership was responsible for allocating the fiscal burden imposed by the ducal treasury among the individual households, ensuring that the collective remained in good standing with the sovereign. This internal governance was mirrored in the creation of a permanent judicial body, which adjudicated civil and familial disputes based on rabbinic law. The acquisition of land for a dedicated cemetery and the installation of facilities for ritual purification further signaled a commitment to permanent settlement. These structures provided the social cohesion necessary for the community to function as a distinct legal entity within the broader Norman state. The administrative efficiency developed in the Seine Valley enabled the community to manage significant capital flows while preserving a rigid cultural identity. This period of institutional maturity established the protocols for record-keeping and leadership that would eventually be exported to new territories during the following decades. The legal standing of the Jewish population within the Norman state was defined by a singular and direct relationship with the sovereign, placing them entirely outside the standard feudal order. While the rest of society was governed by a hierarchy of military service and land-bound labor, These individuals functioned as the personal agents and direct tenants of the reigning monarch. This classification removed them from the jurisdiction of local lords, bishops, and manorial courts, centralizing their legal protection and exploitation under the crown alone. They were recognized as a vital component of the royal chamber, a status that transformed the entire community into a mobile and liquid fiscal reservoir for the state. This arrangement allowed the monarch to bypass the political complexities of the traditional aristocracy when seeking immediate capital for governmental operations. In exchange for this singular dependency, the Crown provided a guarantee of physical security and specialized commercial rights, treating any injury against a member of the community as a direct assault on the royal treasury itself. However, this protective umbrella was inherently transactional and entirely conditional upon the perceived utility of the group to the sovereign's finances. The monarch possessed the absolute authority to dispose of their assets and persons at will, frequently utilizing the community as a source of arbitrary and heavy taxation. Because they were not integrated into the common law of the land, their existence remained perpetually tied to the volatile personal finances and political requirements of the ruler. They occupied a precarious position as a protected but expendable resource, where their prosperity served primarily to underwrite the expansion of central authority. This system of state-managed finance ensured that the wealth generated through their international connections and professional expertise was constantly redirected into royal coffers to fund the machinery of the developing Norman administration. The physical manifestation of the community's presence was defined by the establishment of the Jewish Street, a specialized urban enclave situated within the fortified perimeter of the city. This residential concentration was strategically positioned in close proximity to the centers of administrative and commercial power, facilitating immediate access to the markets and the protective oversight of the castle. The architecture within this district represented a significant departure from the standard medieval building practices of northern France. While the general populace resided in structures composed primarily of timber, wattle, and clay, the Jewish elite invested in the construction of formidable stone houses. These buildings were designed for durability and security, functioning as fortified repositories for the significant quantities of bullion and precious metal collateral handled by the residents. The use of stone served a dual purpose, providing a defense against the frequent urban fires of the era and offering a physical barrier against potential civil unrest. These structures often included deep, vaulted cellars intended for the safe storage of legal documents and financial assets. The concentration of such high-value real estate within a single thoroughfare created a distinct urban landscape that mirrored the community's specialized economic status. This spatial organization was not merely a result of internal social preference, but was a requirement for the systematic monitoring of the population by royal officials. The density of the quarter allowed for the efficient management of communal affairs and ensured that the residents remained a manageable and taxable unit. Beyond individual residences, the street incorporated the shared facilities necessary for the maintenance of a distinct judicial and religious life. The durability and permanence of these stone constructions stood as a visible testament to the group's integration into the urban fabric and their critical role in the maintenance of the city's financial stability. The physical layout of the quarter thus codified the community's position as a permanent, yet segregated pillar of the medieval economy. The central institutional structure of any established settlement was the communal hall, often identified in administrative records as the assembly house or school. This building functioned as the primary intersection for religious, educational, and legislative activities, serving as the definitive hub of the internal administration. Unlike the purely ecclesiastical structures of the surrounding Christian society, this facility was designed for diverse civic utility. It provided a permanent location for the interpretation of complex jurisprudential codes, ensuring that the population adhered to a unified standard of conduct. The leadership within these walls was comprised of scholars who possessed a comprehensive mastery of ancient legal precedents and ethical traditions. These figures acted as the supreme authorities on matters of inheritance, marriage, and internal commercial contracts, issuing binding rulings that maintained order within the group. The facility also hosted a rigorous educational system where literacy and theological analysis were prioritized for all male members from a young age. This commitment to advanced study ensured the continuous production of a learned elite, capable of navigating the requirements of both religious law and royal administrative demands. In its capacity as a legislative center, the building served as the venue for the allocation of collective financial obligations. The officials gathered there to record the assessment of individual contributions toward the heavy levies demanded by the sovereign treasury. Furthermore, the hall functioned as a forum for public announcements and the verification of commercial bonds before they were deposited in official repositories. By consolidating these functions into a single, specialized site, the community created a stable foundation for cultural and legal continuity. The presence of this multifaceted institution provided the necessary social cohesion to withstand external political pressures and economic fluctuations. The authority of the scholars and the administrative efficiency of the Assembly Hall thus transformed the settlement into a self-governing and highly organized body politic within the medieval urban environment. The economic functionality of the community within northern France was predicated on a fundamental divergence between religious doctrine and the practical requirements of a developing commercial society. During the 11th century, the institutional church strictly enforced a theological prohibition against the practice of usury, which encompassed any lending of money in exchange for interest. This mandate created a profound structural void within the medieval economy, as the emerging nobility and urban merchant classes required access to credit to fund agricultural expansion, military obligations, and infrastructure projects. The Jewish population, operating outside the jurisdiction of canon law, was uniquely positioned to manage this essential financial sector. Unlike the broader agrarian society, which held its wealth primarily in fixed land assets and agricultural produce, this group maintained their resources in the form of liquid capital. This fluidity allowed for the rapid mobilization of wealth, enabling the provision of loans that were secured against various forms of collateral, including harvest yields, urban property, and precious metal items. The administrative framework of the Norman state recognized this specialized role, viewing the community as an indispensable mechanism for generating the revenue needed to sustain the monarchy's ambitious territorial ventures. The interest rates applied to these transactions were not merely profit-driven, but were calculated to offset the significant risks associated with lending in a volatile political landscape where legal protections were often arbitrary. Furthermore, the community acted as a primary source of coinage, facilitating the conversion of raw bullion into the minted currency required for the daily operations of the ducal administration. This professional specialization ensured that while they remained culturally and religiously isolated from the landed majority, they were economically interwoven with the highest levels of secular and ecclesiastical power. The presence of this mobile wealth served as the essential lubrication for the transitions from a primitive barter system to a more complex, monetary-based state economy. The logistical capacity of the community to manage large-scale financial operations was significantly enhanced by its integration into a network of transnational familial and professional connections. Unlike the localized and often isolated jurisdictions of the Frankish nobility, these networks spanned the major commercial hubs of the European continent and the Mediterranean basin. This geographic dispersion allowed for the rapid and secure transmission of information and capital without the physical transport of significant quantities of coin, which was a process frequently endangered by regional instability and lack of secure infrastructure. The primary mechanism for this movement was the use of sophisticated credit instruments, such as early forms of bills of exchange and letters of credit. These documents functioned as recognized guarantees of payment, allowing a debt incurred in one city to be settled in another through a corresponding agent or relative. This system relied upon a high degree of mutual trust and standardized record-keeping that was maintained across different political borders. In northern France, the proximity to both the English Channel and the interior markets of the continent positioned the community as a critical junction for this international exchange. They facilitated the movement of specie required for the diplomatic ventures of the monarchy and the military expenditures of the various ducal courts. By leveraging these connections, they could procure rare commodities and metals from distant markets, providing the state with access to resources that were otherwise unavailable through local production. Furthermore, these networks served as a conduit for the transfer of technical and administrative knowledge, ensuring that the financial innovations developed in older centers were rapidly adopted within the Seine Valley. This international dimension of their economic activity rendered the community indispensable to the Crown's efforts to project influence beyond its immediate borders. The ability to coordinate financial actions across vast distances provided a level of strategic flexibility that the emerging national administrations were only beginning to emulate. Consequently, the community functioned not merely as a local fiscal resource, but as a vital link in a global economic chain. The process of migration into the Norman domains was facilitated through a rigorous and centralized administrative protocol known as the royal license. This legal instrument functioned as a formal permit, granting specific individuals or groups the right to traverse the borders of the duchy and establish permanent residency within the urban centers. Unlike the organic and often unregulated movement of the general medieval peasantry, the arrival of these migrants was a meticulously managed state activity. The issuance of such a permit was an indicator of the high political and economic significance the Crown attached to these new subjects. Each license provided the recipient with a guarantee of safe conduct, placing their persons and their movable assets under the immediate protection of the sovereign's peace. This protection was essential for the secure transport of the significant wealth and professional equipment that accompanied the arriving elite. Upon entry, the newcomers were subjected to an official inventory, where their identities and capacities were recorded by ducal clerks to ensure they could be integrated into the state's fiscal framework. This systematic oversight prevented the local nobility from imposing arbitrary tolls or residency requirements, as the royal permit superseded all regional and manorial jurisdictions. The grant of residency often included specific exemptions from certain civic duties and taxes, further incentivizing the settlement of individuals possessing rare financial or technical expertise. By utilizing this system, the monarchy exercised absolute control over the demographic composition of its urban enclaves, ensuring that the arriving population was exclusively comprised of those who could contribute to the Crown's fiscal objectives. This controlled immigration policy transformed the migrants into a privileged cohort whose existence in the realm was legally distinct from the indigenous population. The royal license thus served as the foundational contract between the individual and the sovereign, defining the terms of their residency as an asset of the state. Consequently, the legal identity of the community was anchored in this initial grant of monarchical favor. The internal governance of the community in Rouen was anchored by a specialized judicial tribunal known as the House of Judgment. This body operated as the primary mechanism for resolving civil and personal disputes, ensuring that the population remained subject to an indigenous legal framework. Comprised of 3 distinguished men recognized for their mastery of rabbinic jurisprudence, the tribunal exercised a mandate that was entirely independent of the Norman secular and ecclesiastical courts. This judicial autonomy allowed the community to settle complex matters regarding marriage contracts, inheritance distributions, and domestic commercial disagreements without involving the ducal administration. The rulings issued by these judges were considered binding and were supported by the collective social and religious pressure of the enclave. One of the critical functions of this tribunal was the authentication of financial documents and the verification of credit agreements before they were formalized. This rigorous internal vetting process provided a layer of commercial security that was highly valued in the volatile medieval market. The judges also managed the intricate details of property transfers within the Jewish street, ensuring that all transactions adhered to established traditional protocols. By resolving these matters internally, the community prevented its private financial and familial affairs from becoming subject to the potentially arbitrary interventions of royal or manorial officials. The existence of this specialized court system was a key factor in maintaining the group's cultural and legal coherence while they functioned as an economic minority. Furthermore, the tribunal acted as the definitive authority on ethical conduct and ritual compliance, preserving the social standards of the group. The administrative efficiency of this internal court reduced the burden on the royal judiciary, which the Crown found advantageous as long as the group remained fiscally productive. Consequently, the House of Judgment served as the institutional backbone of the community, providing the necessary legal stability for long-term urban residency and commercial success. The establishment of a specialized facility for ritual immersion, identified as the ritual bath, constituted a critical milestone in the demographic stabilization of the community in Rouen. Unlike residential or commercial structures, this installation required sophisticated engineering to ensure a continuous supply of natural, flowing water, often necessitating deep excavation to reach the local water table or the diversion of subterranean springs. The investment of significant communal capital into such a permanent and immobile fixture provided a verifiable signal of the intent for long-term residency. This infrastructure was essential for the maintenance of religious purity standards, which governed the daily lives of both men and women within the enclave. By securing these facilities, the community ensured its spiritual and social autonomy, preventing the need to rely on external or unregulated resources. The presence of such a structure also required dedicated administrative oversight to manage the technical upkeep and the strict observational protocols associated with its use. In the broader urban context, the construction of this facility represented a claim to permanent physical space within the city's architectural fabric. It functioned as an anchor for the surrounding Jewish street, reinforcing the geographic boundaries of the settlement. The durable nature of these stone-lined chambers meant that they often remained intact long after other buildings were altered or destroyed, serving as enduring archaeological evidence of the group's historical presence. Furthermore, the systematic use of this facility supported the internal social standards that distinguished the minority from the surrounding Christian populace. The logistical complexity of maintaining such a site under royal jurisdiction demonstrated the community's capacity for organized self-funding and technical planning. By prioritizing this installation alongside the Assembly Hall and the Judicial Tribunal, the leadership solidified the institutional foundations necessary for the survival of the group across generations. The ritual bath thus functioned as a silent guarantor of the community's continued existence and cultural integrity. In November of 1095, a significant ecclesiastical gathering took place in the central French region of Auvergne that fundamentally altered the social and political landscape of Western Europe. The Council of Clermont, presided over by Pope Urban II, concluded with a public proclamation calling for a coordinated military expedition to the eastern Mediterranean. The official objective was to provide military assistance to the Byzantine Empire and to secure Christian control over the city of Jerusalem. This initiative was primarily designed as a strategic reorientation of the violent energies of the European military class, attempting to channel the chronic internecine warfare among the nobility into a single, externally directed campaign. By sanctifying warfare against an external religious adversary, the papacy sought to consolidate its own authority over the secular rulers of the West. However, the rhetoric utilized to mobilize the aristocracy resonated far more broadly than the ecclesiastical hierarchy had initially anticipated. It ignited an intense and volatile wave of popular religious fervor that permeated the lower strata of society, including the urban poor and the displaced peasantry. This mobilization occurred through the efforts of charismatic itinerant preachers who disseminated the crusading message across the northern French provinces. The resulting movement, often operating outside the structured command of the knightly class, prioritized a totalizing religious identity that viewed all non-believers with extreme hostility. As the call to arms moved through the Seine Valley and toward Rouen, it introduced a new and destabilizing ideological element into the medieval urban environment. The previous reliance on the secular peace of the dukes began to encounter a populist religious fervor that did not respect traditional administrative boundaries or established legal protections. This environment fostered a collective mindset that equated the internal presence of religious minorities with the external adversaries targeted in the East. The Council of Clermont thus acted as the primary catalyst for a fundamental shift in public consciousness, transforming an external military project into an internal social crisis. The unprecedented scale of this religious mobilization undermined the traditional mechanisms of civic order, effectively paving the way for the popular violence that would characterize the coming months. The implementation of the crusading mandate underwent a rapid and radical expansion as it moved beyond the control of the established ecclesiastical and military hierarchies. While the official armies were still in the early stages of organizational preparation, a parallel and much more volatile movement began to coalesce across the northern provinces. This secondary wave was characterized by its heterogeneous social composition, attracting large numbers of the rural peasantry, the urban destitute, and minor members of the landed gentry who lacked significant feudal ties. This mass of participants operated without a centralized command structure or a formal logistical plan, relying instead on immediate environmental resources for their maintenance. Unlike the professional military contingents, these groups were not bound by the customary codes of medieval warfare or the specific strategic objectives of the papacy. The presence of low-ranking combatants and landless individuals introduced an element of unpredictability into the movement. As their adherence to the mission was driven by a mixture of economic desperation and extreme doctrinal interpretation, this social upheaval bypassed the traditional systems of manorial and civic restraint, creating a mobile and poorly regulated force that traversed the territory with significant speed. The lack of institutional oversight meant that these bands frequently engaged in the unauthorized seizure of supplies and the disruption of local markets to sustain their progression. This development transformed the nature of the mission from a disciplined state project into a widespread and unguided social phenomenon. The absence of a recognized leadership capable of enforcing discipline allowed for the emergence of various autonomous bands that operated according to their own internal logic and perceived religious necessity. As these groups increased in size and momentum, they became increasingly detached from the secular authorities who had traditionally guaranteed domestic stability. The sheer volume of participants overwhelmed the capacity of provincial administrations to maintain order along the transit routes. This lack of constraint established the conditions for the subsequent redirection of violence against the resident civilian populations. The ideology of the crusade underwent a fundamental and lethal distortion as the movement advanced toward the French interior. While the original mandate from the central religious authority specified the liberation of distant eastern territories, the internal logic of the unregulated populist bands shifted toward a more immediate program of religious cleansing. A central premise emerged among these participants that the spiritual purity required for the success of the mission could only be attained by addressing religious differences within their own borders. This rationale posited that it was logically inconsistent to seek out distant adversaries while ignoring a perceived hostile presence within the domestic urban environment. The concept of the enemy was thus expanded to include any group that rejected the dominant religious tenets of the time. This transformation of thought was facilitated by the absence of institutional control over the itinerant speakers who radicalized the masses through inflammatory rhetoric. These figures utilized historical and religious interpretations to frame the local minority as a contemporary manifestation of ancient opposition to the faith. By designating the resident population as an internal threat, the movement provided its participants with a local objective that required neither maritime transport nor complex international logistics. The previous distinction between a foreign military target and a protected domestic subject was systematically erased. This shift in thought transformed the urban enclave from a recognized financial asset of the state into a symbolic and physical target of purification. The mission began to emphasize the necessity of total uniformity as a prerequisite for receiving divine favor. The resulting climate of hostility was characterized by a conviction that the properties and persons of the minority were legitimate spoils of a holy war. This development signaled the collapse of the secular legal protections that had previously integrated the community into the administrative social fabric. The mission thus became a tool for domestic exclusion, prioritizing religious absolutes over the pragmatic requirements of state finance and civic order. The spring of 1096 marked a critical escalation in the radicalization of the crusading movement, as independent bands began to operate under the leadership of minor Northern European aristocrats. These leaders, exemplified by a prominent noble from the Leiningen region, consolidated forces that were increasingly detached from the formal command of the higher nobility. The operational priorities of these groups shifted toward the systematic assault on urban centers situated along their transit routes. This vanguard established a precedent for totalizing violence, where the objective was the immediate eradication of religious difference through force. The methodology employed in cities such as Speyer, Worms, and Mainz provided a functional template for future outbreaks of civil disorder. In these instances, the traditional legal boundaries that separated civilian populations from military combatants were entirely disregarded. The leadership of these bands utilized their aristocratic standing to legitimize the seizure of communal assets, framing the plunder as a necessary logistical requirement for the journey eastward. This activity represented a profound failure of the established regional governors to enforce the secular peace. The news of these successful and unpunished incursions filtered rapidly into the northern French provinces, particularly into the Seine Valley. These accounts acted as a psychological lubricant, emboldening local agitators in cities like Rouen to emulate the predatory behavior of the Rhineland contingents. The historical records of this period indicate that the violence was not a series of isolated riots, but a coordinated expression of a new, militantly exclusionary social order. The traditional reliance on the protective mandate of the sovereign was undermined by the realization that localized populist movements could bypass central administrative constraints with impunity. This climate of terror ensured that the presence of established minorities became a point of extreme vulnerability. Consequently, the crusading mission was permanently altered from a regulated military campaign into a mechanism for domestic expropriation and social fragmentation. This phase signaled the total collapse of the civil protections that had sustained urban life for over a century. The social volatility of the late 11th century was exacerbated by the widespread financial obligations that permeated all levels of the urban and rural population. While religious zeal provided the primary impetus for the mobilization, the underlying economic reality of deep-seated indebtedness served as a critical secondary motivator for the escalating hostility. Many members of the minor nobility and the burgeoning merchant class had entered into extensive credit agreements to maintain their social standing or to finance their various feudal requirements. These obligations often spanned multiple years, creating a state of chronic fiscal pressure that bred significant friction between the borrowers and the creditors. The religious narrative of the crusade provided a convenient and potent justification for the articulation of this economic resentment. As the populist movement gained momentum, the desire for spiritual purification became inextricably linked with a pursuit of immediate financial relief. The crusading vow itself required substantial liquid resources for equipment, provisions, and transit, which many prospective participants could only secure through further borrowing or the liquidation of their remaining assets. This dynamic created a paradoxical situation where the very individuals targeted by the movement were the sole source of the capital required to fund the mission. The rhetoric of the itinerant preachers capitalized on this tension, framing the extraction of interest as a moral offense that justified the total cancellation of existing debts. By reinterpreting financial liability as a spiritual burden, The agitators provided the populace with a moral framework to pursue the physical destruction of the archives, where these obligations were recorded. This intersection of economic desperation and religious fervor ensured that the assault on the community was seen as a virtuous act of liberation from worldly bondage. The failure of the secular authorities to regulate these credit markets or to protect the creditors allowed for the totalization of this predatory logic. Consequently, the fiscal architecture of the region was viewed no longer as a necessary utility, but as a barrier to the divine mission, turning the pursuit of religious goals into a mechanism for the violent redistribution of wealth and the obliteration of legal accountability. The physical transition from ideological hostility to active aggression materialized in Rouen during the early months of 1096. As the unregulated crusading contingents entered the city, the municipal mechanisms of restraint experienced a total and rapid collapse. What began as localized disturbances quickly transformed into a province-wide state of emergency, as the traditional boundaries of urban discipline were disregarded by the armed bands and the local populace. The assault was characterized by a systematic targeting of the Jewish district, where the previously secure residences were subjected to coordinated acts of arson. By utilizing fire as a primary weapon, the attackers circumvented the defensive advantages of the masonry constructions that had traditionally protected the inhabitants from minor civic unrest. The resulting infernos served to flush the residents into the streets, where they were no longer shielded by the legal sanctity of their homes. Simultaneously, organized looting commenced, focused on the extraction of high-value commodities and minted currency stored within the private vaults. This was not a chaotic or random plundering. It was a methodical appropriation of assets designed to fund the logistical requirements of the advancing mission. The rioters targeted specific workshops and residences known to contain the raw metals and finished luxury goods essential for international trade. The participation of the local urban populace was critical in this phase, as their intimate knowledge of the city's topography allowed the attackers to navigate the district with lethal efficiency. The city guards and royal officials, who were sworn to uphold the ducal peace, remained largely paralyzed or actively complicit in the breakdown of order. This failure of the state to intervene signaled the end of the era of protected residency, transforming the thoroughfares into zones of active and unpunished conflict. The scale of the property destruction and the total loss of communal security forced a permanent shift in the community's tactical priorities. The focus moved from maintaining commercial operations to a desperate struggle for physical preservation amidst the ruins of their former professional identity. As the urban district became untenable due to systematic fire and civil collapse, the community enacted emergency protocols for physical preservation. They sought refuge within the massive walls of the ducal keep, the primary military fortification of the city. This move was predicated on the established juridical principle that the persons and assets of the group were the absolute possession of the ruler. In the medieval legal tradition, any violation of royal holdings or the individuals housed within them was categorized as a supreme offense against the crown. The fortress represented the physical extension of the duke's authority and was intended to be an unassailable sanctuary. The transit to the keep required the coordination of hundreds of individuals who abandoned their masonry residences to occupy the confined spaces of the military ward. This mass movement occurred under the scrutiny of the local constable, the high-ranking official responsible for the maintenance of the royal defenses. The sudden influx of civilians into a structure designed for a small military garrison created immediate logistical complications regarding the distribution of supplies and the maintenance of sanitation. The refugees carried only the most portable and essential assets, relinquishing their remaining properties to the looters in exchange for a hope of survival behind massive fortifications. The populist bands, bolstered by their successful incursion into the Jewish street, redirected their assault toward the royal castle itself. This represented an unprecedented challenge to the central administration, as the mob demonstrated a willingness to bypass the traditional reverence for the sovereign's domain. The siege of the keep forced the ducal representatives to choose between enforcing the royal peace and succumbing to the demands of the radicalized populace. The isolation of the community within these walls transformed their legal protection into a physical imprisonment, as the fortifications that provided safety also prevented any possibility of escape. This phase of the conflict tested the limits of the monarchical mandate to safeguard those who served the treasury. The siege of the royal stronghold in the city signaled a terminal breakdown in the administrative order of the 11th century state. While the fortress was legally defined as an extension of the sovereign's person, the radicalized contingents demonstrated a calculated disregard for the traditional sanctity of crown properties. This confrontation was not a localized riot, but an overt challenge to the central governance of the territory. The armed participants, having already dismantled secondary urban defenses, directed their military hardware against the primary gates of the castle. Historical evidence suggests that the assailants utilized professional siege techniques, including the construction of scaling devices and the use of heavy projectiles, to compromise the masonry perimeter. This escalation transformed a domestic persecution into a full-scale insurrection against regional authorities. Within the keep, the officials responsible for the maintenance of the royal peace found themselves in a state of terminal indecision. The constable and his guard, though theoretically empowered to use lethal force to protect the crown's interests, were hesitant to engage in combat with individuals who claimed a sanctified mission. This hesitation reflected a profound shift in the social hierarchy, where religious identity began to supersede traditional obligations of secular law. The failure of the garrison to disperse the gathering masses outside the walls effectively legitimized the mob's actions. As the siege progressed, the lack of a decisive military response from the central government emboldened the attackers to intensify their efforts to breach the inner sanctum. The political consequence of this inaction was the demonstration that the monarch was no longer capable of providing a credible guarantee of security for those under his immediate jurisdiction. The inability to preserve the peace within a royal garrison indicated the total fragmentation of the legal system that had sustained urban stability. By failing to uphold the inviolability of the castle, the local administration ceded its authority to the unregulated populist movement, making the crown's protective mandate effectively obsolete. The containment of the community within the stone walls reached its terminal phase as the besieging forces issued a definitive and non-negotiable ultimatum. This demand represented a total rupture in the traditional handling of religious minorities, moving beyond fiscal exploitation toward a mandate for absolute spiritual uniformity. The choice presented to the refugees was a binary opposition between immediate religious conversion through the rite of baptism or summary execution at the hands of the mob. This ultimatum effectively abolished the legal category of the protected non-believer that had sustained the community's residency for generations. The requirement for baptism was not intended as a voluntary acceptance of new dogma, but as a compulsory mechanism for the total absorption of the group into the dominant social and religious order. Those who accepted the rite were promised physical safety and the preservation of their personal assets, though their entry into the Christian populace was marked by a complete loss of their former legal and cultural identity. Conversely, the refusal to submit to the baptismal font was interpreted by the radicalized participants as an act of final defiance that justified the use of lethal force. This pressure was exerted with systematic intensity, as the attackers utilized the threat of imminent death to break the communal resolve of those sheltered within the keep. The presentation of this choice signaled the final abandonment of civil order, as the mob replaced the Duke's statutes with a self-proclaimed mandate for religious purification. The officials within the garrison, having failed to disperse the assailants, effectively permitted this extra-legal interrogation to proceed. This stage of the conflict transformed the survivors into a population whose existence was no longer guaranteed by service to the state, but was contingent upon the total renunciation of their ancestral heritage. The finality of the ultimatum ensured that the former social contract was permanently dissolved, making the physical survival of the individual the sole remaining priority. The failure of the royal defense within the fortress forced the captive community to confront the terminal stage of the siege. When the mob's ultimatum of religious submission was delivered, a significant portion of the population rejected forced transition. This rejection was manifest in a coordinated program of self-destruction. This practice, historically described as the sanctification of the divine name, was rooted in a theological mandate prioritizing spiritual integrity over physical survival. By choosing to end their own lives, the individuals within the keep exercised a final form of autonomy that the state could not co-opt. The mechanics of this collective act were conducted with a degree of organization mirroring the community's traditional discipline. Heads of households often took the responsibility for the termination of their own dependents to ensure they did not undergo the rite of baptism or face the brutality of the rioters. This behavior was supported by the conviction that a compelled conversion represented an intolerable violation of their ancestral identity. Contemporary chronicles indicate that these events occurred within the inner chambers of the royal castle, transforming the site of intended sanctuary into a location of massive demographic loss. The process was a necessary defense against the violent pressures of the external society. This decision represented a profound crisis for the medieval administrative system, which viewed the death of these subjects as the destruction of crown assets. The act functioned as a definitive barrier against the forced erasure of their cultural history. It was a deliberate strategy to circumvent the compulsory assimilation demanded by the populist movement. The scale of this resistance in Rouen proved that the pursuit of spiritual uniformity resulted in the total liquidation of a productive class. By opting for this terminal path, the community ensured that their final act remained a matter of internal jurisdiction, denying the mob their goal of religious conversion. This event established a legacy of martyrdom that defined the community's historical narrative. For the segment of the population that did not participate in the terminal acts of sanctification, the only remaining path for physical survival involved an unconditional surrender to the besieging forces. Survivors emerged from the inner fortifications under a specific promise of physical immunity conditional upon their immediate religious transition. However, the total breakdown of the ducal peace meant that these assurances were frequently hollow. As individuals exited the sanctuary of the keep, they often encountered a radicalized mob that disregarded the terms of surrender, resulting in the summary execution of many who had hoped for safety. For those who survived this initial violence, the state and the ecclesiastical hierarchy implemented a series of highly structured and compulsory rituals. These were not private ceremonies, but public, state-orchestrated events where priests utilized the apparatus of the church to administer the rite of baptism to large groups simultaneously. This process effectively functioned as an administrative erasure of their previous legal and religious identity. The transition transformed the survivors into a new and precarious class of subjects known as converts, who remained under the intense scrutiny of both the secular and religious authorities. This change in status carried profound legal implications, as the Crown no longer recognized these individuals as members of a protected minority, but as neophytes within the Christian fold. The institutional church maintained that once the sacrament was administered, even under the duress of extreme violence, it was spiritually indelible and could not be revoked. This theological stance prevented the converts from ever legally returning to their ancestral traditions without incurring the penalty of death for heresy. The wealth and property of these individuals were now subject to different forms of taxation and ecclesiastical oversight. This mass-forced conversion thus completed the demographic destruction of the organized community in the city, replacing a distinct fiscal entity with a marginalized group of new Christians. This change concluded the traditional Jewish tax records. The transition from physical violence to the systematic destruction of administrative data marked a specific phase of the 1096 crisis. While the initial riots focused on the seizure of tangible wealth, the mob quickly recognized that the true source of their long-term grievance resided in the written archives. These records comprised the formal bonds and credit contracts that documented the extensive financial liabilities of the local nobility and the urban merchant class. In the absence of a central bank, these handwritten documents served as the sole legal evidence of ownership and obligation. The rioters targeted the official repositories, where these communal and private ledgers were stored, often breaking into the specialized chests used for the safekeeping of financial papers. The public burning of these documents was a strategic act designed to achieve the permanent obliteration of individual and collective debt. By converting the parchment and ink into ash, the participants effectively erased the contractual basis of the regional credit market. This destruction provided immediate fiscal relief to the debtors, as there were no duplicate records to verify the existence of the outstanding loans. The loss of these archives represented a significant blow to the ducal treasury, which relied on these documents to calculate and claim the portion of the interest owed to the crown. Furthermore, the burning of the records removed the legal proof of property titles and land grants that the community had acquired over several decades. Without these instruments, the survivors and the state could no longer authenticate the previous distribution of assets within the city. This act of administrative arson transformed the temporary displacement of the community into a permanent and irreversible economic excision. The erasure of the written record ensured that the financial architecture of the region was fundamentally reset, preventing any future legal efforts to recover the seized capital. The bonfire in the public square functioned as a definitive and final conclusion to the commercial history of the community. The administrative climax of the 1096 crisis in Rouen was the transition from unregulated mob aggression to the implementation of a formal state policy of expulsion. Following the wide-scale destruction of property and the mass conversions within the fortress, the Norman crown determined that the continued presence of the Jewish community was incompatible with the maintenance of public order. The monarchy acknowledged its own inability to provide reliable or consistent protection against the overwhelming surge of popular religious fervor. Consequently, a decree of removal was enacted, serving as the definitive legal mandate for the total clearance of any survivors who had rejected baptism. This document functioned as a formal withdrawal of the sovereign's protective umbrella, effectively revoking the historic permits that had once guaranteed safe residency. By stripping the group of their status as direct tenants of the king, the state removed the last remaining barrier to their physical removal. The decree was a cold, administrative calculation designed to pacify the radicalized urban populace by finalizing the exclusion of the minority. It established a strict schedule for the departure of all non-converts, marking the end of their recognized existence within the duchy's administrative framework. This mandate did not merely permit the exodus, but actively enforced it through the threat of further state-sanctioned violence or permanent imprisonment. The Crown's refusal to restore the previous legal order signaled a permanent shift in the political landscape, where the fiscal utility of the group was now outweighed by the necessity of domestic stability. This official act of banishment provided the legal justification for the immediate and total liquidation of the community's remaining communal presence. The decree ensured that the demographic vacuum created by the riots was formalized into a permanent state of ethno-religious homogeneity. In doing so, the monarchy completed the transition from a specialized, multi-layered administration to a more simplified and exclusionary urban governance model, concluding the community's historical tenure in northern France. The implementation of the expulsion order necessitated an immediate and systematic disposal of all assets that could not be physically carried by the departing population. Families were forced into a process of rapid liquidation concerning their domestic and commercial property under the extreme pressure of absolute administrative deadlines. This was not a standard market transaction, but a predatory environment where the sellers possessed no bargaining leverage. Local buyers, fully aware of the impending date of mandatory departure, offered prices representing only a small fraction of the actual replacement value of the items. The inventory of goods subject to this forced sale included furniture, textiles, domestic implements, and the residual stocks of luxury trade items that had survived the previous riots. This mass transfer of goods resulted in a significant and permanent shift of wealth from the departing minority to the resident urban majority. Because the state had already moved to forfeit fixed real estate, the focus was entirely on converting every available household object into minted coinage, or high-value portable gems. These compact forms of wealth were essential for basic survival during the transit, yet the exchange rates imposed by local intermediaries were deliberately exploitative. The Crown did not intervene to regulate these lopsided agreements, perceiving the devaluation of these assets as a secondary mechanism of communal disenfranchisement. This liquidation process ensured that the departing individuals began their exile with only a negligible portion of their former net worth, effectively neutralizing their ability to re-establish competitive professional operations elsewhere. The physical clearance of these goods also facilitated the immediate repurposing of the residential interiors for the new occupants designated by the royal administration. This phase of the crisis finalized the economic dismantling of the community, ensuring that the exit was marked by sudden and profound poverty. The systematic extraction of value from the refugees provided a final economic gain for the city's merchant class and established a lasting local precedent. The final phase of the expulsion was defined by the comprehensive and permanent confiscation of all fixed property remaining within the urban perimeter. As the population departed, the legal title for every parcel of land and every masonry structure they had occupied was automatically transferred to the sovereign treasury. This mass forfeiture was a deliberate administrative seizure, justified by the principle that the assets of such subjects were essentially the property of the monarch. The formidable stone residences, which had once been the center of the community's wealth, became the most valuable spoils for the royal administration. Royal officials conducted a meticulous inventory of each property to determine its market value and strategic utility for the state. Many of these high-value homes were subsequently reallocated to members of the local nobility and loyalist merchants as a reward for their political support during the period of civil disorder. The communal buildings, including the former assembly halls and centers of higher learning, were similarly seized and repurposed for secular or ecclesiastical functions. In many instances, the Crown sold these properties to the highest bidders, providing a massive one-time injection of capital into the royal coffers, which was used to fund military and administrative projects. The ownership of communal burial grounds also reverted to the state, representing a final and complete rupture with the historical legacy of the group. By taking control of these immovable assets, the monarchy ensured that the former residents could never legally return to claim their previous holdings. The transformation of the urban landscape was total, as the physical markers of the previous inhabitants were absorbed into the mainstream property records of the kingdom. This orchestrated seizure completed the financial objective of the expulsion, turning a demographic crisis into a significant real estate windfall for the central government. The Royal Exchequer issued new deeds for these lands, facilitating the long-term expansion of the Crown's influence and finalizing the total economic excision of the minority from the territory. The departure of the remaining non-conforming population resulted in a profound demographic transformation of the city's interior. For the first time in the recorded history of the Norman administration, the urban environment was stripped of its most distinct legal and social minority. This physical removal created a localized vacuum that extended beyond simple residential vacancy. The departure of an entire specialized class of residents meant that the complex web of interactions that had defined the city's commercial life was severed. The specialized corridors of exchange which had facilitated the flow of currency and commercial bonds were silenced, leaving the urban core without its primary financial engines. This absence of the group that had functioned as a bridge between the monarchy and the wider European economy resulted in a period of economic stagnation within the specific district. The legal identity of the quarter was effectively erased, as the royal government had no subjects left within that jurisdiction to monitor or protect. This demographic collapse paved the way for a totalizing ethno-religious homogeneity that the region had not experienced since its initial Norse settlement. Every resident within the city walls was now, at least nominally, a member of the same religious and legal hierarchy. The diverse linguistic and cultural markers that had once characterized the street vanished, replaced by a uniform social order governed exclusively by canon and feudal law. The administrative machinery of the city was simplified, as officials no longer needed to manage the distinct judicial requirements of a separate population. This period of homogeneity was not a natural evolution, but the direct result of a calculated state-sanctioned excision. The city was reorganized as a monolithic entity where no alternative cultural presence was tolerated. This demographic uniformity allowed the religious authorities to expand their influence over the urban landscape, resulting in a city that was monolithic in identity but stripped of the specialized expertise that had once driven its financial growth. The official integration of the former Jewish quarters into the ecclesiastical and municipal map of the city began with the immediate transformation of specialized communal buildings. Once the Crown had finalized the forfeiture of the urban landscape, the institutional church moved to occupy and sanctify the most prominent stone structures. The Grand Higher Academy, which had served as the intellectual nerve center for northern France, was promptly rededicated as a parish church or a localized chapel. This process of consecration involved a complete architectural and symbolic overhaul, where the interior spaces were reoriented to face the eastern horizon and the central lecture platforms were replaced by stone altars. The former religious assembly hall, noted for its capacity and central location, frequently became the primary site for a new congregation of the local Christian majority. Secular officials also utilized these sturdy masonry buildings to establish administrative offices for the collection of tithes and the management of royal grain stores. The subterranean levels and vaulted chambers, originally designed for the safe storage of diverse scrolls and communal wealth, were repurposed as crypts for the clergy or secure repositories for ecclesiastical tax records. This rapid change of use was documented in new land charters that omitted the previous history of the structures, instead identifying them solely by their new Christian nomenclature. By embedding the church into the very foundations of the former district, the authorities finalized the psychological and physical removal of the minority. The sounds of the Latin liturgy replaced the traditional methods of debate and legal interpretation that had once defined the street. These renovated buildings stood as visible monuments to the triumph of the crusading ideology over the previous pluralistic administration. The conversion of these facilities ensured that no physical trace of the group's distinct religious infrastructure remained to challenge the new, monolithic social order established within the city walls. The streets themselves were frequently renamed to honor the saints to whom these repurposed structures were dedicated. The forced dispersal of the survivors marked the transition from a concentrated urban presence to a fragmented existence across several political borders. This movement was characterized by the collapse of the previous familial and professional cohesion that had defined the original administrative heart for over a century. Refugees traveled in small, clandestine groups to evade the hostile populations that remained active along the primary merchant routes. The primary destination for many of these individuals was the expanding territories across the Northern Sea, while others moved toward the more established communities in the eastern provinces and the southern coastal regions. In these new locations, the migrants arrived as destitute outsiders rather than as the privileged agents of the Crown. The process of integration into existing local structures was fraught with administrative and social difficulties, as the newcomers competed for limited resources and professional opportunities within the existing urban frameworks. The sophisticated organizational protocols that had governed the previous river basin were largely lost during the transit, forcing the exiles to adapt to the diverse customs and legal variations of their new hosts. Historical records from the early 12th century document a significant shift in urban demographics across the continent, reflecting the absorption of these displaced persons into the local fiscal and social registers. This period of relocation introduced a permanent state of geographic instability, as the survivors were often forced to move again in response to changing regional politics. The loss of a centralized intellectual and administrative core meant that the group's cultural evolution became increasingly decentralized and varied. Furthermore, the specialized financial services they had previously provided were now conducted under much more restrictive conditions and with significantly higher levels of local oversight. This fragmentation ensured that the once unified and powerful commercial network was replaced by a series of isolated and vulnerable enclaves. The long-term consequence of this exodus was the permanent alteration of the medieval social fabric entirely. The Royal Treasury Department initiated a comprehensive forensic audit to quantify the total value of the assets that had transitioned to the state. This administrative undertaking required specialized clerks to investigate the remnants of the urban economy following the departure of the former residents. While many primary contracts had been destroyed during the civil unrest, the government utilized secondary administrative lists and oral testimonies from borrowers to reconstruct the defunct credit market. The objective was to generate a definitive ledger of all outstanding financial obligations that the Crown now intended to collect directly. These officials established a centralized registry where every documented loan and interest payment was recalculated to reflect the monarch's new position as the primary creditor of the realm. This process effectively transformed private commercial debts into permanent state revenue, ensuring that the Treasury profited from the residual financial architecture of the displaced group. The audit extended to a detailed valuation of the reclaimed agricultural lands and urban masonry structures that had been integrated into the royal domain. Each parcel was assessed for its future tax potential and its capacity to support new loyalist tenants. The findings of this survey were recorded in the permanent financial scrolls of the kingdom, serving as a foundational document for the reorganized provincial economy. This systematic tally allowed the sovereign to measure the exact increase in royal wealth resulting from the expulsion, confirming that the Crown had successfully captured the liquid and fixed resources of its former agents. The administrative clerks also investigated the accounts of local officials to ensure that no seized bullion or precious metals had been diverted during the chaos of the riots. By finalizing this audit, the state closed the fiscal cycle of the previous era and established a new baseline for the centralized management of the territory's wealth. The final accounting demonstrated that the monarchy had achieved a total consolidation of the region's economic levers under its own direct authority. The institutional memory of the events in the settlement region provided a prototype for the later development of the centralized nation-state. This period demonstrated that the totalization of religious identity could serve as an effective cover for the comprehensive seizure of a minority's collective resources. The methodology developed in the late 11th century proved that a supreme authority could successfully navigate a period of civil disorder by aligning the central fiscal needs with the popular demands of a radicalized majority. This synchronization between governing enrichment and ideological purification established a precedent that would be refined by Western European rulers for the next 300 years. Subsequent administrations in neighboring kingdoms utilized these specific protocols to resolve chronic budget deficits through the calculated cancellation of residency rights. This model revealed that the legal standing of a specialized group was not a permanent grant, but a temporary convenience that could be revoked to facilitate a massive transfer of wealth to the ruling house. The historical record indicates that the precedents set during this urban disturbance were studied by royal counselors who sought to expand the influence of the state over private capital. These later figures adopted the practice of setting strict departure deadlines to trigger the automatic forfeiture of all communal and individual assets. Furthermore, the 11th century unrest proved that a unified command could effectively survive the destruction of a vital economic sector if the resulting plunder provided a sufficient short-term windfall. The legacy of these events was the institutionalization of the idea that minority populations were essentially a human reserve of capital, intended to be liquidated at the moment of the state's greatest financial or political necessity. This established the conceptual foundation for the exclusionary policies that would eventually define the borders of the modern European state. The administrative success of the urban expulsion thus provided the legislative framework for the repeated cycles of dispossession that characterized centuries of the Middle Ages. If you found this history interesting, this next video will shock you. Click right here to watch it now.